All right, we just finished discussing mechanization in early 19th century agriculture, the improvements made to increase crop yields and to minimize labor requirements in the north and northeast. What we're going to talk about now are transportation improvements, national roads, canals, the advent of the railroad, and even and then talk about the factory system, especially the large Lowell factory in Massachusetts, along with a system, a labor system referred to as the Waltham system, which is an all-female workforce. So we'll try to get all that into this next series of lectures. Now, transportation. In the 1850s, transportation is slow, difficult, expensive. A trip from Boston to New York takes 4 days. Today, if you wanted to travel from Boston to New York, you take a plane. You would spend more time trying to get through airport security than you actually spend on the plane making the trip from Boston to New York. But back in the early 1800s, it takes 4 days of overland travel, grueling overland travel. 1850s to 1840s, networks are going to develop to cut the costs and the time required to travel these great distances. John Quincy Adams is going to adopt the American system that Henry Clay has come up with. It's a system that's pro-development. Today we would call it infrastructure. Henry Clay is establishing this American system to federalize, sort of, to provide centralized funding for these kinds of national improvements, bridges, roadways, canals, and things like that. Even though it's not at this point a popular idea, most of these things at this point are going to be driven by private investors. Henry Clay's model is an idea that by the government investing funding into these areas, it's going to increase the amount of revenues that are able to be generated. This American system has really 4 parts. Number 1, a huge protective tariff to protect American industries. As I said, the manufacturing industries in the United States are slowly starting to take hold, but they need protection from the European industries. The second thing is a strong support of the central bank. They want to recharter the Bank of the United States of America, so it's referred to as the second bank. The third thing is that this funding from the tariffs, funding of these projects like canals and roadways and things like, and bridges, things like that. And then the fourth thing that's important is what Eli Whitney and people like Eli Whitney and Eli Terry had done with these ideas of standardization and mass production. Standardization, if standardization can be established across a board, any organization can start to contribute to a major project because of standardization. We think of standardization, I guess the most recent aspect of standardization is this sort of conflict between Blu-ray and HD DVD. Blu-ray won out as a standard. I guess back in the 70s, the big competition was over the standardization of video cassettes, either VHS tapes or Betamax tapes. Most of you don't know what a Betamax is, so as you can see, half of you probably don't know what a VHS is at this point. But one becomes the standard, and that's what everybody gears towards. So once you've established a standard, everyone can produce things based on that standard. Eli Whitney does this with his building of rifles in his firearms company. So this is an important part of the American system, this dependence upon standardization and things like that. Now, Congress doesn't really go along with this centralized planning. There's a lot of people who believe that since these are private organizations that will be benefiting from this federal funding, why should they be allowed to make a profit off of the things that the federal government has funded for them? So it's going to be a problem. So most of these investors, most of these improvements are going to be done by private investors. Okay, some of these private companies are, especially with the roadways, the early roadways, they're going to attempt to create turnpikes and roadways that they can have control over, that they can create sort of monopoly. If you live in New York and you create a roadway leading down to Pennsylvania, but the people in Vermont want to sell maple syrup in Pennsylvania, this businesses in New York have control over the New York roadway that they had funded, and they are, in a way, are going to create a kind of monopoly. These will actually be challenged all the way to Supreme Court, some of these monopoly questions, and the result will be that none of these state monopolies are going to be allowed to exist. The National Road will be built from Baltimore to Central Ohio. Most of the funding for this road is built by the businesses and factories in Central Ohio. They want access from Central Ohio all the way to the Baltimore ports, because the port in Baltimore is large enough for them to ship goods out and over to Europe. Turnpikes and roadways will increase after 1815. Stagecoach lines will increase, making it easier for people to travel up and down the, especially up and down the coast. Steam travel is still not really feasible at this point. However, most people's travel, at least in one direction, is going to be along rivers. The navigatable, it's hard to see on this map, but all of the navigatable rivers are going to be the primary highway systems of the age, where most of our goods and supplies are shipped from one state to another, will be along these rivers. And most of the travel in the development of Tennessee history, the Tennessee River coming from East Tennessee going down and then coming up to West Tennessee, the Cumberland River also coming in here and going around Nashville and then emptying into the Ohio River, and then the Ohio River emptying into the Mississippi River. So river travel is going to be the predominant method of travel during this time period up to this point. Now, the big winner, especially for the businesses, is going to be the canals. The canals are going to be a thing that produces an enormous boon for shipping goods and cargo, especially to these port cities. Canals are essentially artificial rivers. They provide two-way traffic. These canals are built wide enough to where two barges would be able to pass back and forth along the canals. Okay, it's slow going, right? The barges are pulled forward by horses. Horses walk along the sides of these canals, and then once you get to a lock, which adjusts the elevation from a higher elevation to lower elevation, you bring the water level up, and then the horses or mules are able to continue pulling the loads down the river or up the river. The primary benefit, even though it's so slow to move things on these canals, on horseback you could probably put maybe a quarter of a ton on the back of a horse. You could strap these things to horses and mules. If you have a horse pulling a wagon, you may be able to pull a half a ton, maybe 3/4. You might even be able to get a ton if you've got multiple horses pulling the wagon, but it's going to be hard and arduous work. On a canal, one horse or mule will be able to haul 50 tons of cargo up the canal. Okay, basically because the cargo is floating on this artificial river, these horses and mules are able to just give it enough momentum to where inertia allows it to travel and float along the canal. And the horse just has to walk and pull. So a horse can work 8 to 10 hours a day just walking from point A to point B. Okay? And so what would happen along these canals, these large canals, you'll have towns will pop up, and they'll be referred to as river towns, especially in New York, especially around the Erie Canal. You'll get up in the morning and you'll eat your breakfast and you'll pack your lunch. You'll go out to your barn and get your mule, and you put the harness on him and you go down to the canal. You hook up your horse to a barge, and you start walking. You'll stop when they get to a lock, and the lock will raise your barge, and you'll continue on. But then, once you've traveled for about 4 or 5 hours, you unhook your horse, and you leave it in the lock. You cross the bridge to the other side. You eat your lunch. You take your break. Then you come back to the canal, and you hook up to the barge going south. And for the next 5 hours, you pull the barge south. So you've worked a 10-hour day, and you've hauled 50 tons of cargo north and south, an enormous distance compared to what you could have hauled if you were just using this horse to pull a wagon. Okay? Some of the canals that are most famous, the Schuylkill Canal in Pennsylvania is about 108 miles long. Then the Erie Canal, 350 miles in New York. You can see a number of these canal systems all throughout the upper part of the United States, but what you don't see are these canal systems in the South. You don't see them in the South. The South has, as far as the South is concerned, a significant number of navigable rivers that will take their cargoes from the interior of the South to the port cities. You can see all these rivers leading to these port cities, right? And from these port cities is where all the cotton and all the produce are being sent out. The South doesn't need to industrialize. The South doesn't need to create these artificial waterways, because they've got the waterways connecting them with the markets that they want to sell their crops to. Again, these canals are going to be the big boon. It cuts the cost of shipping goods to market by 1/10 over what it costs to ship things overland. Winter even provides smooth area for sleds. You can put small loads on a sled and go from lock to lock, and you can still haul cargoes even in the wintertime on these frozen rivers. There's also going to be, this is also the advent of the private railroad. As you saw in the one film clip that I put on the PowerPoint from the guy who played Father Brown, these things aren't very fast, and they're very cumbersome. So the earliest railroads in the 1930s are going to give the canals a little bit of competition. The first of these is the B&O Railroad, 13 whole miles of track. Soon, more than 3,000 miles will eventually start popping up around this region, through this whole area through here, okay, between Baltimore and Ohio. Passengers are going to flock to these things, possibly because of the novelty of the notion of this railroad, but also because of the blinding speeds at which these things travel. They travel faster than anything that's out in the environment today. We're talking a grand whopping 15, maybe 20 miles an hour. That's fast. Most modern science of the period believed that if the human body were exposed to those kinds of speeds over great distances, it would flay the skin from your body, cause your eyeballs to burst, and all kinds. Well, that's science for you. We just want to protect Americans. But these blinding speeds are going to be... But if you think about it, what goes 20 miles an hour in the 1830s? Well, a horse going 20 miles an hour won't go 20 miles an hour for long. But the railroad, 20 miles an hour at distance. So the railroads are going to start becoming the thing, because now you've gone from hauling 50 tons to hauling 50s of 50 tons by using one locomotive. Now, the next thing we need to talk about is the advent of this factory system. Most of the early machinery is water-driven, as you saw in the videos from the English textile mills. From these English textile mills, they all operated based on water power, systems of gears and pulleys and everything, and then they would operate the machinery. Okay, steam comes later. Steam comes later, and will basically allow you to build these factories that are no longer have to be close to river systems. They no longer have to be close to river systems, and steam also provides for a more consistent rate of power. The steam power is always at the same rate. Samuel Slater had brought, kind of illegally, the mechanical spinning machine from England. All of these mills that we watched, that we talked about in England, who were spinning the wool and the cotton in England. Slater brings one of the designs for those things over to the United States. When he does so, he brings the perfected designs. All these other guys had to worry about how to find the perfect match, the perfect tension and everything. The thing that Slater brings to America is already perfected. And so they're going to start building these textile mills, spinning mills for both wool and cotton and flax all throughout New England, okay, along the rivers. It's hard to see, but the big Lowell plant, okay, is the largest circle. The Lowell plant employs more than 3,000 employees. Each one of these other plants, depending on the diameter of the circle, is that percentage. So the larger the circle, the more people employed. You can see, well, you can't even see the rivers in Connecticut and Rhode Island, but all through here, following these river systems are where all of these factories are built. And you can see in Rhode Island, some of these factories are fairly substantial. Now, the female labor force that's going to be utilized is something that was developed in Waltham, right, just west of Boston. This is the idea. In the film, the short excerpt, the sort of documentary you're going to look at, is going to explain this in more detail. What's going to happen during this time period? Young women on the farms, okay? The only prospect you have, for those of you who've read the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, the only prospects you have is if you marry well. And during this time period, young men are looking for wives who can bring a substantial dowry to the wedding. They bring something to the marriage. So the young man has his savings, his inheritance, and the young woman brings her dowry. They combine these little patches of wealth to create their nest egg. From this nest egg, they build their home and they start their business. And that's the American dream. If you don't have a good dowry, then you're not a good prospect for marriage. And as, like I said, for those of you in the history class, the idea that you have to marry well in order to advance forward is part of what the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments is about. So what this factory system does is it hires young women between the ages, normally the ages are, where's my thing, it doesn't say, usually the ages of 14 to 21, sometimes 16 to 21, where these young women will come to these factory towns, and they will they'll live in a dormitory kind of situation or in a boarding house kind of situation, in which their parents are guaranteed that they're always chaperoned, they're always governed, so someone is always taking care of them. Okay, what's going to happen is they go to work in the factory, and really the machines do all the work. What the women do is they have to change the bobbins and put the new spool on there, and each one of their machines has like 24 spindles. And so they stand and they watch for the spindles to fill. When the spindles fill, they turn off the machine, they take off the full spindle and they put on an empty one, and they wind the thread around and turn the machine back on. And it starts working again. Okay? So a lot of the time they're just standing watching the machine. So they read books, and there are some accounts of young women actually completing their education while they're watching the spinning machines work. Okay? Now, the problem being that these mills start popping up everywhere, and everybody starts using this Waltham system, the way of hiring young women to do this work. Now, eventually, the profits start to plateau. Well, it's because they flood the market with thread. So the profits start to plateau, and the managers say, there must be a problem. Let's go find out what the problem is. And so what they do is they look out, and they see all these women standing in front of a machine. And so they say, we're not paying those women to stand around. Let's give them another machine. And so they double the amount of work they have to do. So they're going to look at this side, they're going to look at this side. But really, most of their time is still spent standing waiting for the machines to complete. But the profits start to go up again, so the management doesn't notice. In very short order, the profits will start to plateau again because you've just introduced even more thread onto the market. So they go back out to the floor. What do? They see these women standing and reading and writing, waiting for the spindles to work. Well, let's give them 4 machines. So now they really have to work. Now they really have to, that's what go. And so these women, as you're going to see in the video, these women actually organize and go out on strike because of the continued increase in their production rates without an increase in their pay. Okay? And so it's going to be one of the first times you have this thing. However, most of the time, these young women, as they're working in these areas, when they complain about the work, the bosses say, listen, your dad knows where you are. He signed the contract saying you could come here. So they try to slough it off as the women being lazy, but they continue to increase labor production and cause the work to be more strenuous, and they go out on strike on them. There are other avenues. It's just the Waltham system is the clearest example of this factory system being introduced into this arena, and how the women have to learn to work within these operations. There's other things that happen, sort of cottage industries, like for instance shoe binding. I guess if you were to get a Red Book magazine today, there are still companies out there that will pay you to make latch hook rugs. They will send you scrap materials and a box so that you can produce latch hook rugs and put them in a box and send them to them. You just sit at home and make them, and they send you a check for these things. Back in the day, all of the skilled labor part of making shoes was in cutting the leather to proper sizes. You could sign up from one of these magazines to become a shoe binder, where they would send you all the parts for the shoes, and then you would meticulously sew the leather together and sew the uppers to the lowers, and then send the shoes back to the company, and then you would receive a check for each pair of shoes that you had sewn. So all of these things are happening, especially in the Northeast. Where they're not happening is in the South. Where they're not happening is in the South. The South doesn't need to mechanize to cut labor costs. The South sees that if it needs more labor, all it has to do is get more slaves. So this distinction between the North and the South as we approach the Civil War has a lot to do with this notion of labor, what the philosophy of labor and how it functions properly. Okay, and so what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to start talking about changes in the United States during the as we approach the 1840s and 1850s.